opera goers will recognise the situation. The house is still, the lights have gone down, and then a man in a dinner jacket comes through the curtain and says, one of our performers has a problem and craves your indulgence. And I feel rather like that singer at this moment. When Docky asked me to speak on this occasion several months ago, I thought I could prepare most of it in advance and then maybe update it a little day or two before. But given what's been happening, and the speed has been happening on two fronts, the UK election and the Euro, I've ended up writing some of it on the plane. But I think what you lose in polish, I hope you will gain in immediacy. Now, the ground I want to cover is why did the election turn out as it did? How was the inconclusive result handled? The significance of the outcome for British policy in Europe and for the Euro. And finally, how will the UK sort out the economic problems where we have they're largely unaddressed, whereas in Ireland you're some way down the track. Now, why did the election turn out as it did? The first thing is, in a sense, why did Labour lose? The first thing to recognise is that incumbency gradually becomes a disadvantage and a millstone. You get blamed for everything that's gone wrong, and getting us into the economic mess outweighs the credit you get for the achievements in stabilising the situation, but we haven't, in a sense, got out of it. That was a problem that Labour could not avoid, and the same on many other aspects of policy. Second, I would say, is that the public services deal was, in the public's eyes, was not fulfilled. Services, many public services are better. Hospitals are certainly a lot better, but the out-of-hours service of GPs is probably worse. And the performance in our schools has plateaued. We have lots more policemen, but people don't really, they don't believe the crime statistics. And when they say, yes, I know X and Y is better, but you've doubled the amount of money you've spent on it. And they don't think they got the value for money deal that they were promised in 1997. Now, the Iraq War, I think, played rather remarkably little in this election, partly because the Conservatives are also implicated. But I think a moment came that when Tony Blair came and gave his performance before the Chilcot inquiry, everyone said, well, I've always believed that he didn't really care what reason he adduced for this enterprise. He was going to lead us into it, and we knew that anyway. And at that moment, I think interest in this issue has largely gone away. Finally, there is you've got to come some point come to the personality of Gordon Brown. I've been inadvertently on the record at in an interview I gave to the FT. I think if I'm going to say anything about it, I'll say it in the Q&A, but we can explore that later. The next question is, why did the Liberals not do better? At one point, they were second in the polls, got up to about 29%. Well, one issue was that they peaked too early, and that left 3 weeks for the other two parties to work out how to handle this issue. I think there was also a flaw in the Clegg presentation. He's a man who loves the big idea, and he had he went for a number of kind of dramatic viewpoints. The immigration amnesty, non-replacement of Trident, rejection of nuclear power, breaking up the banks, and gradually the other parties were able to dig away at that, and these kind of large certainties began to crumble. The other thing is then, why didn't the Tories win? At one point they had the 38 to 40% in the poll, which should have just got them over the majority line. A principal problem was they could not play a traditional Tory card of you will get lower taxes under us than you will get under Labour, because it was very obvious that there were going to be higher taxes. They may not be as high as they were under Labour, but that message was muted. And the austerity message, which George Osborne ran for a time, it was clear this was not only having no traction, it was actually positively unpopular. And so they had to retreat from that. So they weren't able to present the traditional Tory distinctiveness. They had this idea of the big society. Well, you can tell me what the big society is. I don't think anyone knows what the big society is. It never caught on as an idea. It was never defined in sufficiently concrete terms. Then, of course, there is the electoral system, that they got 36% of the poll and ended up 20-odd seats short of majority. In the last election, Labour got 35% of the national poll and ended up with a majority of 60. So there's something like a 7-8 percentage points advantage to Labour in this in the system. What effect did UKIP have? By and large, I think they did pretty poorly, but they were knocking up, say, 2,000 per constituency, and there were some constituencies where that made the difference. Now, how was this inconclusive outcome handled? Well, the background is that we have a long history of two-party government, 250 years of it, really, if you date that from the emergence of Walpole as Prime Minister, Tories and Whigs, Tories and Liberals, Tories and Labour. And there's only a period from about 1918 to 1931, during which time Labour was overtaking the Liberals, first as in terms of votes and then in terms of seats, where you had a genuine three-party system in Parliament. So it's not surprising all our institutions aren't very well geared towards it. Our electoral system doesn't handle it well. House of Commons is configured as two sides. We think in terms of the swingometer. Not even BBC could produce a swingometer that swung that way and this way. But it was clear that a hung parliament was a major possibility. And people began to do a lot of work on it. The first that was necessary was to clarify how our political processes in an unwritten constitution work. So there was a lot of misunderstanding of this. And some very good work was done with the help of the constitutional professors, one of whom, Robert Hazel, I think has been here, Hazel, Bogdanor, Riddell, Hennessy. Bit of help from ex-cabinet secretaries, and also we've now had the benefit of being able to see how these systems work in Scotland, Wales, set aside Northern Ireland as sui generis, and New Zealand, and we began to get a better understanding of how this whole process might work. So the first thing was to produce, it was a chapter that would be part of the ministerial code, it's called Chapter 6, which set out all these understandings, and which had never really been done before. The first principle is that the Prime Minister is the Prime Minister until he resigns, and ultimately he could resign immediately because he knows he can't command a majority of the House of Commons. He could hang around and try and do a deal, as Heath did in 1974, or he could actually produce a deal and face the House, where he might win or lose the vote. In effect, people have to understand that we have a two-stage system. We elect an electoral college. It's not like the US, where they have an electoral college, meets once and then they disband and go off. The House of Commons is the electoral college, and ultimately it is the vote there which determines the outcome. The second part of this preparation was to get ready to support the negotiations, how logistically it would happen, where they'd meet, did they have the civil service available to help them with the drafting of documents if necessary. And there was also a certain amount of wargaming of a number of scenarios, one of which, I'm told, was actually quite close to the outcome that we got. The third was to be ready to prepare two documents. And here we were able to use Scottish experience. The first document is you might call the programme document, and the synthesis of this has been, or the synopsis of this, has been published. It's about 6 or 7 pages long, and we are promised a longer version of it. And the second, and probably the most difficult, is the partnership document, how it's all going to work. How does this cabinet work? How do you resolve disputes? Who shares what information? How does confidentiality and collective responsibility operate? Or where are there carve-outs for it? And all that work is going on, and it will soon see the light of day. Now, we tended, in the event, we actually improved on all this, the script that we had prepared. We tended to conflate two ideas. Because the Prime Minister is the incumbent, I think we assumed that the Prime Minister had first go. Now, Nick Clegg cut through this by separating these two concepts, because while the Prime Minister was the incumbent and had to deal with the events of the day, principally the Euro meeting, Clegg said he would deal first with the party with the strongest mandate. He never defined in advance what it was, and so in the end he was lucky that it was unambiguously the Conservatives with most seats and most votes, and also the sense of momentum, having won 98 seats. This was working quite well. Gordon Brown came out on the street, and his statement was, pretty much what the experts would have said he should have said. The only wobble was the Brown, Mandelson, Campbell spoiler, I would call it, where they said they were responding to an invitation of the Liberal Democrats. I suspect it was the other way round. Interestingly enough, that announcement was made before the Labour cabinet met. I find that rather shocking, actually, that could happen, but that's what I'm told happened. But it shrivelled very quickly. And then the Conservative Liberal Democrat talks resumed. Why did it shrivel? One is it incorporated Gordon Brown staying on for about 4 months and then being replaced by someone who hadn't gone through this hybrid presidential parliamentary scrutiny of the debates. The idea that someone completely different would then be our Prime Minister just didn't meet any kind of common sense, even though it was constitutionally perfectly proper. The Red-Yellow coalition didn't have the votes, and when you added the nationalists, it became unstable, and you've got a group of blackmailers coming in with you, interested only in their particular partisan interests. But also, the more you added nationalists, the more you inflamed an underlying issue, which is the so-called West Lothian question, which is, how do you reconcile the fact that the Conservatives have a majority of 60 in England, and much of the legislation is about England, and you're mobilising the Scottish nationalists to vote on English matters? So anyway, this idea collapsed very, very quickly. A lot of the senior people in the party, Blunkett, John Reid and so on, were very much against it. So we went back to the blue-yellow discussions. Now, I have to say, did I expect a full coalition to emerge? No, I didn't. I thought that these talks would go on up to some point where people said, well, it's make up their mind time, and then they would conclude that they would agree to disagree. I thought that the gap, particularly on Europe, electoral reform, on tax measures, would be too large to bridge, but then I'm a bureaucrat. The politicians had more imagination, prepared to take greater risks, and they pulled it off. And I think some remarkable compromises have been made on both sides. In particular, they've agreed on a referendum on an alternative vote system, although they've agreed that each will campaign separately for it. The figures I've seen, it doesn't make as much difference as you would think. It might make, by the time you've netted off the equalisation of the size of constituencies, which benefits the Conservatives, and their losses under AV, they wouldn't be very much worse off. Will it last? I would say it will last for the two reasons. One is neither side will want to be seen to be quitting while we still have, in a sense, a crisis. They don't want to be blamed for precipitating a political crisis before we've solved the financial crisis. But the main reason is the Liberals don't want to fight a second election under the existing rules. They want to get the new rules in place, and then they can fight an election on those rules. Right, now, the Europe. Well, while Westminster was fiddling, Rome, but Brussels was burning. Ironically, the last time I came to Dublin on official business was about 8 years ago. I came with a Treasury colleague to talk to the Irish Currency Conversion Board, which was regarded as having done a very good job, because we were in the prepare and decide phase of our relationship with the euro. Now, of course, we have moved a very, very long way. The coalition agreement now says not only will we not join the euro in the next 5 years, we won't even do any preparations for it. And I think basically the issue, as far as Britain is concerned, is probably dead for a generation. I don't know how we can ever get in, because you can only get in if people can say the grass is greener. You want to join this thing, it's because it's really successful. And, well, it could be that Europe suddenly has this great economic renaissance, but if that difference, the grass is greener because we are doing very badly, that isn't the time when you've got a strong government who's confident to lead anyone in. And it's very difficult to reconcile those two requirements. Now, Prepare and Decide came to an end with the 5-test assessment in June 2003. Interestingly enough, in preparing for my Chilcot inquiry hearing, I wanted to be able to demonstrate that I did have a day job at the time, and there were other things going on, and I looked at the minutes of the meeting of June 2003, and the Cabinet says, in principle, we think we should join the euro. And there it is. But, they were advised by Gordon Brown that it wasn't an appropriate time to do it. But there it was. No one would remotely write anything like that now. Now, many people regard Gordon Brown's greatest success as keeping the economics in the forefront of that discussion and keeping us out. And the main reason given was a lack of flexibility in the UK economy, which would be necessary. We had to improve that flexibility if we were surrendering two instruments of policy, the exchange rate and monetary policy. At the time, Tony Blair was pressing for a kind of glass half full presentation, are we nearly there, which Gordon resisted. The only concession Gordon made to show, we're getting a little bit nearer, was that we dropped RPI minus X as the inflation target, which the Bank of England uses, and went to Consumer Price Index, which has no housing in it at all, which the ECB uses. And it was actually a terribly bad decision, completely unnecessary, and we have a much inferior index. But that was the only concession he made. Now, how does it all look now? Well, serious flaws in the euro structure have revealed. It involves a monetary policy in which is a kind of average of all requirements. For some countries, I would say Ireland was one of them, Spain another. The interest rate was too low, and the UK would have been in that camp. So the danger was our boom would have been even worse. Now, we had these very low interest rates here, plenty of developers and bankers prepared to leap in and take advantage of that, and you can see the consequences as you drive around Dublin. We created an impression that all government debt was equivalent. It was all denominated in euros, and there was insufficient differentiations. Now, if Greece manages to stay in the euro, never again will people regard Greek government debt as remotely comparable with German government debt. There you have a system in which there are very few budgetary transfers. You take Scotland, if the Scottish economy, things happening there which means it goes into decline, the amount of money that the UK government is putting in will increase. That is largely absent from the euro design. And the final feature is that the budget disciplines, the Stability and Growth Pact, failed, and people just burst through these limits. And in the case of Greece, they largely cheated their way in by, we now recognise that their public finances weren't in the state that they claimed before. The response has been a huge increase in the emergency lending and in this creation of a stabilisation facility. But these are kind of post facto forms of help, which help someone who's got into difficulty get out of it. It doesn't stop people getting into difficulty in the first place. So now we have talk of rebuilding the Commission's ex-ante powers of surveillance, and there's also talk of people have got to address this whole question of fiscal coordination and solidarity. So I think Europe is kind of trapped, really. The head says you need to move forward, but the heart says the politics aren't there. Now, there is one technical interesting development, which is the ECB is banned from bailing out any particular government, but there is a way around it, which is the so-called quantitative easing, and the decision to relax the credit requirements to allow them to either borrow or make it easier for the component banks to buy government debt. You have a kind of quantitative easing, which is a sort of backdoor way of lending from the central bank. But the difficulty is that the ECB is saying we do not want to relax monetary policy. We think we've got it where we want. So if we're going to have more quantitative easing, we now have this wonderful concept of sterilised quantitative easing, which means that they will buy Greek junk bonds and sell good German bunds. And I don't think that's going to be very popular in a lot of countries, that people have got big enough deficits to finance, and finding that the ECB is selling their debt in order to buy Greek debt. It won't be very popular. And is it actually undermining one of the key safeguards of Maastricht? On the policy on EU generally in the coalition, they have adopted the Conservative proposal for a referendum lock on major transfers of power, have not adopted Clegg's kind of clear the air in or out referendum. The next question then is, will Cameron reverse the withdrawal from the European People's Party? Have a look, well, why did he do it? Did he just do it in order to get elected after Michael Howard resigned, or does he believe in it? And there's a bit of both, perhaps, or maybe Hague believes in it more than Cameron does. The argument was you do not want to be in a political grouping which believes in a even closer union. But if you look at what's happening in Germany, where the obligations of the cost of the obligations that they've taken on collectively are becoming apparent, you can see that there isn't much appetite in Mrs. Merkel's mind for the new treaties and new developments. So why doesn't Cameron just say, well, the reason I parted from her doesn't obtain anymore? I think the answer is he's not going to overtly say, I recant, I was wrong, or times have changed. But I think the way they behave will be closer. They will not be trying to sort of maximise differences. Let's come to the Irish and UK economies. The election highlighted the prisoner's dilemma. It's best if everyone is candid, but the worst outcome is if you're candid and other people are not. And I suppose they're all working on the principle in Guys and Dolls: you mustn't squeeze the melon until you get the melon home, marry the man tomorrow and change his ways tomorrow. And so they all have underplayed the extent of what needs to be done. As I said, the Conservatives started on an austerity budget, but in the end had to retreat. Now, I was asked to contribute a short piece to Prospect about where the cuts should fall. And my answer was everywhere and more. Now, the reason for this is the UK has made the most basic error that you can make in planning public expenditure. I'll illustrate this with some figures. In the pre-budget report of December 2008, which is only a year and a half ago, public expenditure as a proportion of GDP was projected to be 42% and debt about 40%. We now believe this number will be something like 48% and debt more like 80%. The plans that we had created were based on an underlying growth rate of 2.75%, although the government said, oh, we think we're capable of growing at 2.75%, but we'll plan on 2.5%. The problem, I think, is that 2.75% was too high. It's never been achieved if you take some bad years in with the good years. Also, I personally believe that what we recorded as income, GDP, in 06 and 07, turned out to be, we were actually recording capital gains. And so the GDP was never as good, because subsequently, by the time we got to 08, a lot of those profits that banks were reporting had turned into massive losses. So we were flattering ourselves, I think, at the time. The other thing is that the Treasury says we have lost, there's a one-off loss of GDP of about 5%. This is because we're going to have about 3 years where investment is much lower than you would expect, and that would be the basis of growth. So the productive base on which the richness and generosity of public services was planned will be much lower in 2014 than envisaged. Now, we made certain commitments that we're going to raise NHS to about 9% of GDP, very close to the European average. But if GDP's 10% lower than we really thought, why isn't health service being reduced by 10%? You could say the same thing about our overseas aid commitment, 0.7% of GDP. GDP is less, that should be less. But in fact, what is happening is all sorts of carve-outs are being promised. Now, whether you can do that without unjustified and undeliverable cuts elsewhere, I rather doubt. Then there's the question of speed. How quickly do you reduce the deficit? The government said it wanted to reduce, the old government, halve the deficit by 2014. That still means that in every year up to 2014, the deficit will be of a size which caused the debt-GDP ratio to rise. This is a fat man who goes on a diet and says, I'm going to get fatter every year, but it would be a smaller number of pounds that I add, or kilos as you probably, each year. So, in other words, the debt-GDP ratio, and hence the debt-interest ratio, is still, under those plans, still rising for the next 4 or 5 years. Now, why did I say you've got to basically cut everywhere and more? The and more is because the debt is twice as big as a proportion of GDP. It's probably going to cost us 30 to 40 billion more. The 2.5% rise in VAT, which looks pretty certain, is supposed to raise 12 billion. So you'd have to get VAT up to 25% to pay for this. Now, I don't believe, actually, despite the dire position we're in, that we have a sovereign debt problem. The story of rating agencies downgrading our debt, calling in the IMF. I don't think that is how the problem will materialise. You've got to remember, if someone sells UK gilts, they've got to buy something else. Where are these other bonds that around the world that are a great deal more attractive than UK government bonds? I think the real problem is that there is something precious which is called taxable capacity, and it is not being used to improve the health service, universities, the science base, or whatever. It's being used to collect a lot of money from UK the holders of this debt, and then it's being paid back. Raising a lot of money in tax, and then it's being paid back to people that hold this debt. So you have a huge recycling operation which has no political benefit in it whatsoever, because there are no votes in paying debt interest. So that's, in my view, is why you have to get back to a point where the government is spending money on things that benefit society, not simply coping with the problems of the past. Now, we're going to have to take a lot of difficult measures, but we also need to prevent a recurrence. So we need a budget framework that is not susceptible to the jiggery-pokery of cyclically corrected current deficits that we've had. And we need the framework which has an overseer to it. In our case, we don't particularly welcome the Commission in that role, so we're going to have to create something of our own, and in the coalition plans there is a plan for a thing called the Office of Budget Responsibility. It doesn't tell the government what to do, it doesn't take decisions for it, but it raises the political cost of ignoring its advice. So we're left with, we've got 50 days approximately, we have to have a major government statement on tax, spending, borrowing and debt before the Parliament goes into recess. There's a spending review promised for the autumn, but I don't think you can just announce the totals. You've got to announce enough of the big measures to mean that whatever you announce on the totals is credible. So we have come from a position of denial, and we've now got to start asking some really difficult questions. How do we go about it? I think my suggestion is that just as we sent some people here to learn about currency conversion, we need to send over a delegation to Dublin to ask them how you get some really things that are currently not on the political agenda onto the agenda, and how do you get them delivered? Because there are things going on here that would currently be regarded as unimaginable, and maybe we need your help to get through to that point. Thank you.